Can you start off by describing The Crater? What is it about?
The Crater's about one national serviceman, Brian Cleaver's experiences in Vietnam at the height of the Vietnam War. It was May 1968, and Brian, whose marble came out of the National Lottery, which selected who would go to war and who would stay at home and keep their desk job, so to speak. Brian's marble came out, so he felt that he was obliged to do what his country asked of him, and he found himself landing at the beginning of the tail end of the Tet Offensive, when the North Vietnamese Communist forces were coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to try and take Saigon, kick the Americans out, and to install a communist government, which they did some 7 years later, finally in 1975. But Brian was, with the fellow countrymen, 400 other Australians, was put up to be like a tethered goat, a bit of a temptation for these prime North communist troops coming to have a go at Saigon. They were put out there as a bait, and Brian was quite traumatised by that experience, as were a number of his other fellow servicemen that experienced the heat of 2 nights of battle, which raged for about 3 nights each battle in May 1968.
And the crater itself refers to a gravesite where the Australians, the victorious Australians, buried about 42 dead Viet Cong. Is that right?
Yes, they were the soldiers. They were North Vietnamese soldiers who were killed in coming in human wave attacks across the open paddock, 300 metres wide, towards Brian and the other soldiers that were fighting for their lives, literally to stop them penetrating the barbed wire, then getting in amongst it and bayoneting or killing them with their weapons. And when they failed to do that after the first light, and the North Vietnamese retreated and dragged most of their wounded and their dead away, they left 42 bodies of their comrades behind. And the most humane way the Australians could deal with that was to put them into this big 6 metre deep, 9 metres wide bomb crater that was on the battlefield, and that the enemy the night before had used for temporary shelter before they upped and at them and ran at the Australian lines again. And they backfilled it with a bulldozer that the army flew in to give the Australians a chance to sort of fill in that bomb crater. So Brian, in 2002, wrecked with the effects of all this trauma that he'd lived with quietly, and for the 30 years up to that point, decided to go back to Vietnam as a tourist and try and do some mental healing, try and put things together, since he wasn't getting any relief for his mind's sake in the years after he came back to Australia and was demobilised into civil life, and realised after a long time and counselling sessions that he was like so many other soldiers that experienced the First World War, the Second World War, or now Iraq and Afghanistan. He was a victim of post-traumatic stress. So he went back to Vietnam and set it his goal of trying to find these 42 missing bodies of the enemy, which is very interesting that he did it for the enemy. We could understand him looking, Jim, for Australian soldiers that were killed and missing in action, but not so much the enemy. But Brian did that and fell in love with Vietnamese culture and Vietnamese people, and obsessed about finding, and he made 10 trips to Vietnam, and I made 2 trips to Vietnam with Brian in making the film. And this obsessive search of Brian using the coordinates of old military maps and ground penetrating radar and latest sophisticated technology to try and find the bodies, the bones of these 42 missing men, because in Vietnamese culture, until the bodies of the loved ones that are lost in battle are reunited with their families and they do their Buddhist ceremonies, they are like in purgatory. They're like wandering souls. And Brian was bent upon trying to bring some closure or some relief for the families and for himself in so doing.
The film is very much about the themes of healing and forgiveness, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's sort of what I learnt most out of making the film, and what makes me very much an anti-war filmmaker, if you like, in covering my own war zones in Nicaragua and East Timor and Vietnam and Cambodia, where I was ambushed by the Khmer Rouge and so on. What I've learnt most about war is that it traumatizes both sides of young men and now young women who in the Australian Army can be put in the front lines. And it obviously traumatises the civilians who can't get away from the fighting and whose homes are destroyed or their families are wounded with the fallout of what the American military calls collateral damage. And it really makes me very much an anti-war filmmaker because of what I see. And I really would hope that as we face Gallipoli and whether Australia was made as a nation out of war and sacrifice and mateship on the distant shores of Turkey or not, whether our politicians will learn the lessons and in fact not commit our young men and women to war without there being a bloody good reason for doing it, i.e. Australia's territory, as was the case in World War II, is threatened by invasion, and otherwise I really think, Jim, we should mind our own business, and harsh as it might seem, the impact of war and people who defend their own country on their own turf, as we would do, is not really worth it.
David, I sensed watching The Crater that this film is a little bit more sedate than the general tone of the films that you make. Would you agree that this film is somewhat different from the films you tend to make?
It is, and in the light of what I just sprouted out forth then, I don't want people to feel that I'm a predictable sort of left-wing, tree-hugging, whatever propagandist. I make films out of a humane, compassionate view of what I've seen of the world overseas, and knowing that this film would be shown by the ABC in the lead up to the Gallipoli centenary, I wanted to make a film that was a little bit more subtle than what I've been known for. In the same way, I guess, at Frontline, my film about Neil Davis is a very subtle rejection of war and a statement of what war does to people as seen through the eyes of the legendary Neil Davis, who covered the Vietnam War for 11 long years.
Because this film is part of the commemorations for Anzac Day. And you seem to be making a very fine distinction, David, between you as a documentary filmmaker being anti-war as opposed to being anti-warrior. You have a huge respect for the people who do the fighting, don't you? It's just the reasons why they do the fighting that you have an issue with.
I do, and I learn a great respect for the Sandinista soldiers in the mountains of Nicaragua, where I sort of risked my neck to make that film. I have a great respect for the people of Iraq, where I went 2 years ago, but also see the sadness of people. And I'll never forget this little boy who just cried and cried in this low-pitched grieving for the pain that he was in as a result of the war wounds he'd experienced in Iraq. When I went and interviewed his dad and his grandparents, his mother had fled the scene because she couldn't deal with the depression of seeing her little 3-year-old in pain with a head that was 3 sizes bigger than the rest of the shape of his body would suggest or it should be. And, I've seen too much of war, Jim, to sort of glorify in it and think that it's sort of a noble adventure and it makes men of boys and so on. That, at the same time, I acknowledge that it does take place, and I think the veterans of the Battle for Balmoral, which The Crater is about, have been ill-served by the way they were treated when they came back from Vietnam, and half of them were conscripts and they went over there to serve their country, but when they came back, because the anti-war movement had kicked in strongly and because of the My Lai massacre and the exposures of what the Americans had done too many times in Vietnam, suddenly our guys were on the nose and they were treated like they were pariah, that they were baby killers, which they weren't. And they were forced to go underground and lick their war wounds in silence. And a lot of them, as you know, 5 times as many of Vietnam vets committed suicide as a result of being treated ignobly rather than sort of seeing that they did what their country and government told them, the people told them to do, and weren't welcomed back as heroes like their fathers of World War II were.
What would be 2 or 3 guiding principles you adhere to as a documentary filmmaker?
Never be afraid to tell the truth. Always be open to the truth being a very slippery creature and standing at you and itself on its head when you actually get into the meat of the subject, but be brave enough without fear or favour to tell the truth and to keep the camera rolling no matter what, no matter how and difficult that is in the circumstance that you find yourself, to capture that truth and to present that without fear or favour to your audience and let them judge finally what they make of what you put together.
Now, you sort of mentioned at the beginning of the interview, I guess how some people see you as being, I don't know, a radical left-wing tree hugger, whatever the rest of the cliches were. David, in all honesty, how would you describe yourself as a documentary filmmaker? Would you say that you are an agenda-driven documentary filmmaker rather than an observational one?
I think I'm a little bit of both, depending upon what the situation lends itself to. In The Crater, you see my observational skills as a filmmaker. When that moment when Brian embraces his translator at the burial site and in the rubber plantation, after spending sort of 10 trips of self-financed visit to Vietnam. That's a quintessential observational moment, I think, where I'm just staying back with the camera running on my shoulder. I'm able to get in there and ask provocative questions of prime ministers and dictators and anyone else that is stupid enough to, in powers of position, to open themselves to being asked questions of me. I sort of proud of the fact that my name is David and I've got a Christian upbringing that taught me to not to stand up to bullies and never to fear the Goliaths of this world. And I'm proud to be a citizen of this planet and to have 5 children that I hope to hand the planet onto in reasonable shape, though it's not looking very good in that state of world at the moment, to let them continue and with all other people on this planet to share it and to be fair and reasonable to all of us as citizens of the world, not just patriotic Australians, but citizens of the world, because we're facing a very grim future with climate change and the total avoidance by that with our politicians. And what I've seen in 40 years of filmmaking says that things get very nasty very quickly when we resort to a Darwinian attitude to sort out who's going to get what when we don't sit down and act in a reasonable fashion while we've got the time to work out solutions to what we otherwise would do with our Neanderthal club and bashing each other over the head because we don't want to deal with situations when we've got the chance to do it.
You've been nominated twice for an Oscar, once for Frontline and once for the Wilfred Birger documentary Public Enemy #1. You've made some of the best documentaries in Australian film history, as well as some of the most controversial. What is life like for you now? I mean, how do you live? Are you always jagged by what's going on in the world? Do you feel yourself mellowing a bit?
I'm up and down that area, Jim, because now I'm in Perth at the moment trying to get some people to take a more radical film that I made called Waging Peace seriously. And I'm dealing with sort of trying to feed 2 kids that are still at school at age 12 and 5 and a partner and a 25-year-old son that suffers from mental depression and so on. So it's a bit of a juggle to keep it all together. At times I just want to retreat from the world and say it can be damned because people aren't really listening and politicians continue to do the stupid, crazy things that they do. It doesn't matter whether the Labor or Liberal governments. We live in a bit of a sort of a heads in the sand here in Australia still, and I don't know what the end of it will be. I know that I've got limited amount of time, a limited amount of films left to me. I'm a passionate filmmaker, as you can tell, and love to make films to communicate with my audience and to provide an alternative view to what we get from often the mainstream media. But it's very hard to do it because there's so little financing around for the sort of films that I like to make. People want to escapist entertainment. They want to run away from the reality of world and so on when they turn the TV on or they go to the cinema. So not everyone, but the majority. So therefore they're the films that get financed rather than the sort of films that I make against the grain. So it's a bit difficult.